Hey, welcome to the Grayzone. It's another Friday. We are live again. It's Max Blumenthal. I'm here with award-winning Canadian journalist Aaron Mate, who's back from a little hiatus. Welcome back, Aaron. Everyone's been asking after you.
I heard some fun stuff happen while I was gone, including you guys having a crazy fight with GoFundMe, and I was wondering what the latest is on that. You put up a fundraiser. It was very successful. Last time I checked, there was like over $90,000 on GoFundMe. And then all of a sudden, GoFundMe wouldn't let you transfer the money. They told you there were some external concerns. You went over to Spot Fund, where the fundraiser is still going on. I understand. What's the latest with that?
We won. I mean, we defunded GoFundMe. So they take a cut. They're a company. They're not they pose as a nonprofit, but they're a for-profit company. And they not only take a cut of whatever they raise off your back, but they also ask for tips so that they can help other good causes. And lots of people gave tips, and they had to give all of that back. And it seems that everyone understood the stakes here and that we had to teach GoFundMe a lesson. So they also bombarded them with indignant letters and then supported us over at Spot Fund. And we've outraised substantially what we raised at GoFundMe, which means Kit Clarenberg, Alex Rubenstein, and Wyatt Reed will be a part of our organization for a long-term period. I mean, that's still not a lot of money that we're close to 140 now. That's still not a lot for 3 journalists in this economy, but that's what we're a shoestring organization. They're independent journalists. We'll try to raise more, but that's going to support them. So I feel really encouraged about what happened here. And we've been supported by our friends in independent media. Glenn Greenwald had me on, Jimmy Dore had me on. I'm going to be on Russell Brand on Monday. And this has forced a moment of accountability for GoFundMe. Matt Taibbi also and Katie Halper had me on, and Matt actually reached out to GoFundMe and said, "What the hell are you doing?" And they said, well, what we did is perfectly normal, and that the Grayzone voluntarily ended this fundraiser. That's also what they told Al Jazeera. So they're even getting scrutinized by mainstream media. And that is the most cynical lie. They almost never freeze or pause fundraisers due to some external concerns. And there are often external concerns. I mean, they raised money for the millions for the cop who beat or shot to death a teenager in France, sparking riots across the country. They've raised money for all sorts of Israeli causes. So there's no reason to accept that. And yeah, we voluntarily ended it because we had to make sure everyone got their money refunded. I mean, that's the bottom line. And because of all of the PR damage they were suffering, they actually sent someone, still sort of a faceless person with just a first name, to sort of offer us a kind of olive branch on their trust and safety vetting process. So they were basically willing to cry uncle after we rained down fire and fury upon them, but they wouldn't have done it otherwise. And they kept me on the line for weeks without refusing to transfer donations and not telling any of our supporters that their donations hadn't reached us and that they were being held up by some faceless entity. And Aaron, I said in all my interviews, I think the same people who tried to have you kicked off Twitter are behind this.
Well, I think that's a fair bet. Who knows? But I think it's a fair bet. I do got to say, this is the first time I've known you for a long time. This is the first time I can remember you doing anything that I would classify as naive. And that, like you did this on GoFundMe despite knowing, you were familiar with who GoFundMe is and their record before of succumbing to pressure campaigns like this. But I don't know, it looks to me like you naively thought that they wouldn't cave to the inevitable pressure campaign that we always get in situations like this. And I've lost track now of how many times we've had to take a pause from doing the journalism we do to now then defend ourselves from these kinds of insane attacks. But it seems like, I don't know what the average is now, but there's so many
every other week.
Every other week.
I'd almost forgot where we were, stuck. It's kind of like stranded in Lisbon,
Yeah.
Portugal, defending ourselves against like the Zelensky regime because he was canceling our talk at Web Summit. We didn't even know why we'd been invited. And I mean,
yeah. And then when Kit Clarenberg got detained in the UK, and it's still, and that case is still open, right?
The investigation into Kit is still open. I mean, I don't know why he would go back there. By the way, I just was across town. That's why I was a little late, interviewing Craig Murray, former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, who's become a real dissident in the UK, a supporter of the Scottish independence movement, but also one of the leading supporters of Julian Assange. And his blog is just an essential look at British intelligence intrigues and covert operations and propaganda. He just rips them to shreds every day. He's a real gadfly. So they threw him in jail. You remember that. He was jailed for supposedly identifying a witness or an accuser of Alex Salmond, who is the head of the Scottish National Party. And the case was just so shabby and so ridiculous. He was obviously thrown in jail because he was upsetting the British national security state. And everyone's feeling it. But there's just there's a sense that, I mean, my sense is I didn't like sign up to be some dissident or something. This is the kind of journalism I always wanted to do. And I don't think the national security state wants us to be seen in the same light as Julian Assange. They've had to actually just come in and slam the jackboot in his face. What they want to do is keep quietly silencing us, suppressing us. I mean, look at the numbers on our YouTube videos. They're like, we have almost 300,000 subscribers and they're like 4,000 views. We're so obviously suppressed there. And they want to keep trying to get us removed from platforms. But they will act, especially in the UK, with the jackboot instead of the quiet shadow ban, as we saw with Kit. And we'll keep reporting on it. I mean, if we become the story, then so be it. I think that's part of our role as journalists and as advocates is to expose the system any way we can. I mean, if that means just through our sheer existence and what happens to us, then that's important to do.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah. So where have you been?
I'm trying to finish. I've been trying to finish my book about the Ukraine proxy war. And I'm learning every day that a book is a really challenging thing to do. So I'm still not done, but I'm really close, and I don't know when it will be out, but when I'm done, it will be out as soon as possible. And I appreciate the patience of people who, support the Grayzone. And what can I say? Writing a book, it's a lot.
What you can say is, tell us about the book. And is there a separate book about Russiagate, or how are you doing?
Yeah. So the book was, so my initial plan was for a book, like the book I was writing was how Russiagate led into the Ukraine proxy war. But at a certain point, I just realized this book is way too big and it's way too ambitious. This is like a magnum opus if I do it that way. So now I'm going to do actually 3 books. The first book is about the Ukraine proxy war. Second book is about Russiagate. The third book is about the Syria dirty war, particularly all the allegations of chemical weapons and the cover-up of evidence undermining those allegations at the OPCW. That will be the third book in this Russia mania trilogy, basically. So that's the new plan. So the first book will be the Ukraine proxy war.
Well, that's incredible. I mean, if you can pull off the trilogy, I think that'll be an indispensable resource for people trying to understand. It's really about us. It's not about, I mean, it is about Ukraine, but it's really about what's happened to our politics. And, to bring in the analysis of Russiagate as the background noise for the Ukraine proxy war is so essential. Anyone who didn't see with the dawn of Russiagate that we were going to go to war with Russia in the most cowardly way possible, using somebody else's army to fight and die because the political price would be too high if Americans were dying for these soft-handed neocons. If you didn't see that, then you were blind. And that's what you've been saying since 2016, 2017.
And you as well, of course. And the Syria tie here is that Syria is a similar playbook. using, non-US boots on the ground, having a proxy war abroad, trying to undermine a deterrent to US hegemony, which is Syria, because of their support for Hezbollah and Hamas, and just generally being outside of US control, which has been a annoyance of the US national security state for a very long time. So the Syria dirty war was the chance to finally, take out this independent, Arab nation that supports resistance movements. And the Russia tie-in comes when Russia comes in and actually helps save the Syrian government from collapse. And that really angers neocons in Washington, whose animus to Russia only grows and helps fuel this whole Cold War climate. I mean, you talk about some of this in your book, The Management of Savagery. And what I'm going to try to do when I talk about Syria in the third book is just especially the role of chemical weapons allegations in all of this, because to justify dirty wars, to justify sanctions that deny people, the basics they need to live, you have to paint this cartoonish picture of your enemy, in this case, Syria. And in this case, the tool they picked was these chemical weapons allegations, which, as we've covered many times, in all the major cases where there's been serious investigations, all those are shown to be either false flags where the rebels carry them out, as was the case in Ghouta 2013, or faked, as was the case in Duma in 2018. And that's what that book of mine will focus on whenever I get to it after the first two.
Yeah, I mean, if you understand the Syria proxy war and what happened there, you'll easily understand what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And what we saw in Syria was atrocity fabrication on a grand scale, and the construction of this vast media apparatus on the ground that was completely unaccountable to the Western media, but which fed the Western media atrocity exhibition in order to cultivate public support in the West for regime change, arming the Al-Qaeda linked rebels. And that media apparatus was linked to Al-Qaeda as well, arming jihadist bandits to rampage across a country, sanctioning the entire country, then and possibly even direct intervention, which is what McCain was pushing for. So there's actually a book out called Atrocity Fabrication and Its Consequences by A.B. Abrams on Clarity Press. I blurbed it, and it's a really great study. But I think when you zoom in on Syria, like you're going to do, you can understand just how cynical the whole thing was. And they're repeating, they're borrowing parts of that playbook for Ukraine as well, obviously. But I think they're a little bit less aggressive about it because of the fear of direct a lot of Western countries are afraid of direct NATO intervention.
Yeah. And the playbook too of also siding with the most extremist elements of a country to achieve your goals. Like, so in the case of Syria, we were told we were arming moderate rebels. Joe Biden later blurted out the truth when he was speaking at Harvard in October 2014, when he said there was no moderate middle in Syria. Our allies were arming Al-Qaeda with tens of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of weapons. And Biden had to apologize for that because he blurted out the truth. But the only thing he got wrong was that it wasn't U.S. allies doing that. It was U.S. allies doing that basically on behalf of the U.S. The U.S. was at the center of all of this. And that's the only thing that Biden left out. But he still had to apologize because he admitted that the insurgency was dominated by Al-Qaeda. And so this playbook of, in the name of defending democracy, fighting authoritarianism, finding the most extreme elements within a country. In the case of Syria, actually, not even fully inside the country, because so many of the people who were in the jihadi forces came from outside the country, but just finding extremist elements to support, to destroy a country and achieve your own aims. And that's also what happened in Ukraine, where the U.S. sided with the most extreme elements of society, the nationalists, the Bandera movement. That was the driving force behind the Maidan coup, not behind the Maidan protests when they began. That was, tens of thousands of people, many of them ordinary citizens just protesting corruption and wanting to be closer to the EU. But the people the muscle that carried out the coup, as these far-right nationalists bragged about, was, neo-Nazi far-right elements. And that's who then dominated the post-coup government. And that's who then oversaw the ensuing civil war. And that's who the U.S. has been siding with every single time, including when Zelensky was elected on a mandate of peace and the far-right nationalists of Ukraine, threatened him. Essentially, the U.S. took their side rather than Zelensky's side too. So that's the playbook from Ukraine to Syria.
Sergei Bondar of C14, neo-Nazi group, boasted at the Bandera Day event in 2021 that without us, the nationalist forces, Maidan would have been a gay pride parade.
That's right.
And I mean, they were young people who wanted kind of like a pro-European technocracy. And they thought, if they were they thought they're going to be part of the EU and that they wouldn't be the sick, poor man of Europe anymore. And they didn't want corrupt leaders. And I can understand why they went out there. And then the freedom cookies came. The rest is history.
Yeah. And then, by the way, polls still showed the country was deeply divided. So, half the country didn't support the Maidan. Even the peaceful aspects of the Maidan protest didn't even support it. It was a very divided country. And that's why the answer in Ukraine was always to respect its divisions and not try to pull it into one camp, whether it's the Russian camp or the Western camp. But the U.S. policy was predicated on forcing it to make that choice. That's what Bill Burns warned about in his famous cable, Niet means Niet, relaying the concerns of Russians that if you force Ukraine into the NATO camp, that's going to create a civil war and Russia will be forced to intervene, because then millions of formerly Soviet citizens who still identify with Russia, who have family in Russia, will be on one side and we'll be, obligated to protect them. That was Bill Burns warning that in 2008. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. So he foretold a lot.
Yeah. And just not to belabor the point too much, but go back to 2010 and look at the regions that voted for Yanukovych versus the regions that voted for Yulia Tymoshenko, who was sort of the Western Ukraine, the Western Ukraine pro-Western figure. It's almost the same as it's identical to the support for the Maidan coup. And the country was completely divided. And you can also look at that map to understand that map of electoral results to understand the civil war that soon ensued. Those regions that were heaviest in support of Yanukovych attempted to secede. And that set the stage for the proxy war, the Russian intervention or invasion, and what we're facing now. And so many stupid propagandists will instead display a map of the Ukrainian referendum in support of ending the Soviet Union and completely paper over 2010 in order to paper over the ethnic and national divide in Ukraine. And I mean, that's what it all comes down to. So when do you know what the publication schedule is for your book?
No, I just got to finish it. You know how it is to finish a book. It never ends. There's always, but the Ukraine book is close to being finished. I don't know if we can get it out this year, but certainly early next year is a fair bet. And, I just want to make one point about the issue of regions in Ukraine. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong. They can look it up if they want to. I'm pretty sure the only region of Ukraine that did not vote in the majority for Zelensky was Western Ukraine, which is the Bandera heartland, heartland, the nationalist heartland, right? And why would they be the only region in Ukraine not to vote in the majority for Zelensky? Because he was talking about making peace. He was talking about, and I'm not saying he was sincere, but he was talking about making peace, ending the Donbass war. And so accordingly,
everybody forgets about that period. It's such a key period. And he's running against Viktor Medvedchuk, who is, from the Party of Regions. He's portrayed somewhat falsely as a Russian stooge. But he only got like 15, 20% because so much of the Russian speaking population thought if we could just get a consensus candidate like Zelensky, we could finally get this done and end this nightmare. And the US and some of the kind of Soros Open Society backed NGOs in Kiev were initially kind of critical or hostile to Zelensky until he began to turn. And the turn came when he started banning Medvedchuk's TV stations, his broadcasting outlets, just banning opposition media. The US told him to ban them. The State Department openly supported it. He did it. Shoot. And, giving up on Minsk, caving to the neo-Nazis on the withdrawal from the so-called Grayzone in the Donbass. But there was a point when Zelensky, when it was, I remember talking to a legislator from Crimea who I met when I visited Damascus, and I met him. He was Russian, and he said everybody in Crimea is pulling for Zelensky. He's our last hope.
Yep.
We really are hoping Zelensky succeeds, and it's just so crazy to think back on that.
I mean, there's a clip I've shared before of when I interviewed Stephen F. Cohen for the Grayzone, when him and I met up in Manhattan in October 2019. And this was as the impeachment of Trump was getting underway, because Trump froze some weapons to Ukraine while him and Giuliani were pressuring Ukraine to announce some investigations into the origins of Russiagate and the Bidens. And, you know, everyone was on board with this, and like left liberals, progressives were on board because finally Trump was going to be held accountable. They were so excited. And Stephen F. Cohen warned that this is like the last chance to make peace in Ukraine, and that Zelensky needs the US's back. Rather than trying to impeach a president for pausing some weapons to Ukraine, you should be putting all your energy towards supporting Zelensky and protecting him from the far-right nationalists who are threatening his life, literally, if he makes good on his promise to implement peace. And of course, everybody here ignored that, with the exception of us and a few others, you know, in terms of the media. And the rest is history. You know, that, and then Adam Schiff got up and said, we aid Ukraine so that we can fight Russia over there. We don't have to fight Russia here. And progressives either applauded that or didn't think of the implications of celebrating the fact that we're using Ukraine to fight Russia. And 2 years later, the logical end game happened. Russia invaded Ukraine to end the fight, largely as a result of liberals in the US being enlisted in a neocon proxy war and cheering it on rather than trying to stop it. And, you know, I just want to read a quote to you I found. I hadn't seen it before, so I wanted to share it with you because I find it's funny and it's so revealing. It's from Ben Rhodes's book. Ben Rhodes is a former top aide to Barack Obama. Before joining Obama, he was a screenwriter or an aspiring screenwriter, I think. And anyway, then he went on to become like a senior national security aide to Obama, which says something about the Obama administration. Anyway, he's talking in Ben Rhodes's book, he's talking about the Maidan coup, which we were discussing before, Max and I. And this is what Ben Rhodes writes about Putin and his reaction to it. Ben Rhodes says Putin believed that, quote, and I'm quoting Ben Rhodes, Putin believed that, quote, the protests that overthrew Yanukovych were initiated by the U.S. because some of its leaders received grants from U.S. democracy promotion programs. So Ben Rhodes is admitting that some of the leaders of the coup that overthrew Yanukovych received grants from U.S. democracy promotion programs, which is hilarious. Like, that's who our democracy promotion grants go to, is coup leaders. But second of all, he can't understand why Putin would possibly see that the U.S. was involved. When all that happened was we funded some of the people who launched a coup against Yanukovych. And Rhodes is like, you know, mocking Putin for believing that.
Yeah.
You know,
and then on the next page, and then Putin sent Facebook ads against us and destroyed our democracy.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what he does. That's exactly what he does. He calls that an unprecedented attack on our democracy and blah, blah, blah. And he also acknowledges the Victoria Nuland phone call where Nuland was caught picking who would the next prime minister of Ukraine would be, Yatsenyuk, right? And he acknowledges that. And he says that on the call, it sounded like Nuland was picking who the next leader of Ukraine would be. He doesn't have any criticism of that. He doesn't even say anything more about that. But then he says, because Russia, or I mean, we think it's Russia. Let's assume Russia did it. Because Russia was the one that intercepted that call and leaked it, that Russia had crossed the Rubicon. So we don't cross the Rubicon by interfering in Ukraine to the point where we're picking their next leaders before we back a coup. Russia crossed the Rubicon by intercepting our plans for that and releasing it to the public. That's Ben Rhodes' claim in his book. Imagine
if the U.S. got a cable, signals intelligence cable on Russia picking the next leader of Canada. I mean, it would be like Pearl Harbor. They would portray it as Pearl Harbor, but worse. Yeah. We would finally invade Canada. I mean, the invasion should start now, but we would finally do it. And I'd hope to talk about the ADL. We'll get to that. It's the first time they're facing this level of elite accountability or pressure. So I think it's an important moment, and it's important to understand what it signifies. But since we're talking about Ukraine, we could go right into Blinken's trip if you want.
All right. Well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, one of the most devoted war hawks in the Biden administration, firmly opposed to any diplomacy with Russia, to the point where when the nation's top military officer, General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he called for diplomacy, Blinken, supposedly the nation's top diplomat, was firmly against him. And, Milley was basically told to quiet down, and he has since. So Blinken won that round. So now Blinken is visiting Ukraine to, I guess, witness the fruits of his labors by prolonging the proxy war as long as possible, and announcing another $1 billion in weapons, and basically also announcing that the U.S. is going to do in Ukraine what it won't do at home, with some exceptions occasionally, which is invest in Ukraine's infrastructure. So here is the Secretary of State.
For Ukraine not only to survive, but to thrive, we're also supporting its efforts to rebuild from Russia's aggression. At the Ukraine Recovery Conference held in London a few months ago, I pledged that the United States would invest more than $520 million in making Ukraine's energy infrastructure, more than half of which has been destroyed by Russia, cleaner, more resilient, and more integrated with Europe. We're making new investments to enhance the transparency of Ukraine's institutions and to bolster the rule of law, so that Ukraine's democracy is even more responsive to the needs of its people and can attract the private capital needed to rebuild. We're engaged in assisting the government of Ukraine on anti-corruption efforts and on efforts to ensure accountability and full transparency of all the assistance we're providing, as well as the security of U.S.-provided defense articles and technologies.
So that's Tony Blinken assuring us that the U.S. is helping Ukraine root out corruption. This is one of the most, if not the most, corrupt country in Europe, maybe in the world. I don't know.
I mean, just to qualify or to clarify, I mean, Zelensky has fired Alexei Reznikov, the defense minister. He's fired several officials in charge of the draft, which is essentially forced conscription, because they're taking bribes because so many men are desperate to get out of the draft and not die and be cannon fodder for Tony Blinken. So Zelensky is being pushed clearly by the U.S. to make these moves. And I think that's part of why Blinken was there. Don't you think that's because they want Zelensky to be able to be seen as a valid recipient for billions more as the war proceeds indefinitely? And so Zelensky can be sort of reelected with a not so quiet nudge from the U.S. or support from the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. And it was reported, Seymour Hersh reported this, that when William Burns went over to meet Zelensky, whenever that was, that Burns came over with a request that, like, okay, we know you're skimming a lot off the top. Fine. That's par for the course, but just, can you take less money? Can you maybe skim off less money? Because this is getting out of hand. And he gave him a list of a bunch of officials who were just being way too outlandish with their corruption, like driving around in fancy cars and, buying villas. And he asked that they be fired, and they were. So basically,
and Kolomoisky also. He's putting Kolomoisky on trial. That was the guy who basically funded his entire career.
Yeah, I wonder about that. Why is Zelensky now going after the oligarch who backed him to begin with in the first place? I wonder what that's about. It's interesting. And Kolomoisky also was a big funder of the Azov battalion.
He was. I mean, the Panama Papers show that he had created these offshore accounts to basically sponsor Servant of the People, the production of the Zelensky show, which was the basis for his presidential campaign. So this is a major intrigue. I mean, U.S. media has covered it, but they're not talking to Ukrainian insiders. They don't seem very curious about it. They seem a little about as curious about it as they are about Hunter Biden and the firing of the Ukrainian prosecutor, Viktor Shokin. So, but this is all U.S. pressure. It's obviously U.S. pressure to make Zelensky, to legitimize Zelensky. So that's what I think the first purpose of Blinken's trip is. But the second purpose is to rustle up more contracts for the arms industry, keep the war going. I mean, Aaron, you reported earlier this year where you wrote on Blinken's anti-diplomacy tour, where he basically spoke out forcefully against a ceasefire.
Oh, he gave the most insane speech. I believe it was somewhere in Europe, where basically there would be no negotiations at all with Russia, and Ukraine was going to be this permanently militarized, constantly at war country on Russia's border, and we're going to build up Ukraine for the future. All while meanwhile Ukraine's being decimated right now. But Blinken is so unconcerned with Ukrainians that he was already fantasizing about a future when Ukraine can be this like even more militarized U.S. proxy to challenge Russia. Then he wasn't even thinking about the present, and to the point where he went on a global tour to literally procure arms for Ukraine to try to pressure global South countries, because there's been a problem that's been exposed in the last year, maybe more, where the U.S. and its allies actually don't have enough weapons for Ukraine. They don't have the production capacity that Russia does. And so they've been having to go around to other countries that aren't their traditional allies to basically beg for weapons all across the global South. And Blinken went on that tour pleading for weapons, but he got rebuffed. But that's Blinken's job. He's not a diplomat. He's an arms merchant. And there was actually a really interesting line recently in the Washington Post from David Ignatius, who's a veteran columnist, very close with U.S. intelligence and the Biden administration, basically speaks for them. And one thing he noted was that, Ukraine's been begging for these long-range ATACMS,
Yeah.
right? But he said the reason the U.S. isn't giving Ukraine ATACMS, it's not anymore the reason we got before, which is that Biden's concerned about an escalation with Russia. The reason is the Pentagon says we can't give up our ATACMS because we might need those for a conflict with China. So that's
Right.
that's like a reminder that Ukraine does not come first for these people. Hegemony comes first. And right now, a key target of U.S. hegemony is China, and the U.S. is preparing for the possibility of war with China. So therefore, even though we're claiming that Ukraine's in this existential battle for its freedom, that they're the front line of democracy, if Putin doesn't win there, he'll go on to Poland or wherever else they can fantasize about Putin trying to conquer in Europe. Even though we're claiming all that with this lofty rhetoric, when Ukraine asks for something that it says it needs, we can't give them that because hegemony comes first and we might need to fight China. So sorry, Ukraine. So on the one hand, it's like, it's welcome, I guess, that the U.S. isn't giving a weapon that will escalate the war in Ukraine. But when you look at the reason, it's because they need it for an escalation, a possible escalation somewhere else against China.
And we have to teach the Russians a lesson in Ukraine, or China will invade Taiwan. That's what we're constantly told by neocons. I don't know if Blinken himself has used that line, but here's a photo that I think is so revealing of what this whole trip, the cynicism of this trip, and how disturbing it is. It's Tony Blinken in a gigantic cemetery, Ukrainian military cemetery, with Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, his counterpart. I mean, look at this. This is like him presiding over his works.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, as you said, he obstructed diplomacy in order to ensure this much death. And how much death is it? I mean, we hear so many estimates. The Pentagon has put out its own estimate of 150,000 Ukrainian casualties, killed or injured, put out of action by injuries. That's obviously going to be the most conservative estimate, since the Pentagon wants to continue sending weapons. But think about that. What percentage of society that is? What does Ukraine have? 80 million people. The Wall Street Journal has reported 50,000 Ukrainians who have lost at least one limb in this war. That's staggering. That's about the same number of Germans who lost one or more limbs during World War II. And so what was the German casualty count? I think it was like 500,000. It was enormous. I mean, they lost their entire U-boat fleet. Like most of their Navy was wasted. So why are we to believe that the number of Ukrainians killed or injured wouldn't be 500,000?
Yeah.
Considering that they're not exactly getting the best medevac service, during the golden hour, the hour when you can be saved when you're wounded in combat. You need to be immediately evacuated, usually by helicopter. And that's not really happening at the front in the eastern, at the front in the Donbass. So the number, I think, is much higher than 150,000. And that's blood on Tony Blinken's soft little guitar plucking West exec advisor's hands. It's a sickening display, and you have to be completely ignorant of the context to actually take Tony Blinken seriously in this photo, although Kuleba does.
Well, it's easy for people to not get the context because, for example, if you're a consumer of establishment U.S. media, even many dissident media outlets, you would not know. I think arguably the most important fact, unless I'm forgetting something, of the Ukraine war so far, of the post-Russia invasion period of the Ukraine war, because the war has been going on since 2014, but the post-Russian invasion period, since February 2022, you would not know that the U.S. and the UK blocked a peace deal that was reached in early April 2022. So just weeks into the war, multiple sources from Ukraine, from NATO allies, from Israel, the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, from Fiona Hill, former U.S. official, have all confirmed that there was a peace deal reached. The basic premise was Ukraine would remain neutral. The issue of Crimea would be basically frozen, and Russia would withdraw to its pre-February 2022 lines. That was the basic bargain. And yet no major U.S. media outlet has reported this fact. You cannot even acknowledge that a deal was reached, except for in foreign affairs. That's the only exception. Foreign affairs, in this article by Fiona Hill and Angela Stant, reported that U.S. officials had confirmed to them that there was a peace deal. Now, they didn't say what happened to it because I think they didn't want to acknowledge what other people have reported, which is that the U.S. and the U.K. blocked it, as relayed by Boris Johnson when he went over to Zelensky and said, we're not going to back you up if you make a deal with Russia. Russia has to be fought. So if you're a consumer of U.S. media, unless you happen to catch that in Foreign Affairs, which is like an elite journal, you would not know that the U.S. blocked a peace deal that could have stopped this war from getting so much worse. And to illustrate, there's a recent article in the New Yorker by Keith Gesson. It's about is it time to maybe negotiate with Russia? And the main person he interviews is this guy Samuel Cherep of Rand Corporation, who advocates negotiations. But even Samuel Cherep and Keith Gesson, who support diplomacy, even they can't acknowledge that there was a peace deal reached in Turkey that was blocked. They allude to it. So Keith Gesson alludes to it. He mentions that there was talks and they collapsed, but he doesn't actually give what actually happened, which is that there was a tentative deal and it was blocked by the West. But he does, on the one positive thing he does is he does speak to a former Ukrainian official who basically admits that was Ukraine's best chance at peace. And so let me quote this. This is from Keith Gesson. The former Ukrainian official believes that the Istanbul talks were the best chance at a more or less stable peace. Quote, back then, Bakhmut was a beautiful city. Mariupol was under Ukrainian control. But now there is no win-win solution any longer. Someone will have to lose. He hoped it would be Russia, but he feared it would be Ukraine. And I asked him, this is Keith Gesson now, I asked him when public opinion might begin to turn, quote, when every single person knows someone who has been killed or wounded, he replied. And this is now Keith Gesson, the country was getting there. So this is a former Ukrainian official admitting that Ukraine's best chance for peace was in Istanbul at those talks. What Keith Gesson doesn't tell us is what happened to those talks, which is that the U.S. blocked them. And now we're seeing the ongoing result.
Again and again. And what the U.S. condemned countries that are suffering from grain shortage because of the war in the developing world, attacked their calls for a ceasefire at the UN. I mean, that's what his role was. And just one quick point on this idea of negotiations. Now you're seeing all sorts of voices calling for negotiations. It's in the New Yorker, it's in the Nation magazine, which has wavered. It's all over. I think it's too late. The U.S. shafted itself diplomatically because its position and the position of the Ukrainians at the negotiating table was much stronger back then, and it may have been much stronger last fall than it is now that their counteroffensive has been this complete catastrophic flop. That's why they don't tell us about what a failure it is in U.S. media, except in bits and pieces, because they don't want the public to realize. Why would Russia negotiate now? And who do they have to negotiate with? The people who sabotaged every negotiation again and again and again? No, if they have the upper hand on the battlefield, and Ukraine's military is increasingly collection of boys and older men who are being kidnapped off the streets of cities and taken in vans to the front, along with people with very little training, they could go on an offensive themselves. Kadyrov, the leader of the Chechnyan leader, has explicitly said there is no reason why Putin should negotiate. He should just attack. And much of the Russian public believes that as well, that they should just go in hard instead of going in with this special military operation to try to get the West's attention and force everyone to the negotiating table with this Clausewitzian strategy. So I think we're not going to see negotiate. This is going to be settled the same way Syria was, with brute force. And that is a massive tragedy. And Tony Blinken is laughing it up. He's laughing it up with his counterpart, Kuleba, at McDonald's. They're at McDonald's.
We didn't order any ketchup. No, I'm a tourist. I cannot eat you this because of my doctor advice, but I have the same. But I cannot.
Look at this.
I think
forced exchange
is something that she will forgive me with you
Once at least.
Yeah. Okay.
Look at Blinken's cold, dead eyes trying to force a personality.
Where I used to live in Washington, we had a McDonald's around the corner. Very good breakfast sandwich.
Where I used to live in Washington, we had a McDonald's right around the corner.
Right. Yeah, right. He had the breakfast sandwich at McDonald's. Yeah, right. Like everything he says is just oozes phoniness. There's nothing real about this guy. Everything is fake. Everything.
When I was a student, my best hangover food was actually to go to McDonald's.
Well done. I'm sure that was a rare, very rare.
Very, very rare, of course.
Oh, my best hangover food was McDonald's in the morning. I'm sure that was very rare.
I think you're totally. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
Well, they're there to hype up McDonald's to get corporate investment in Ukraine, because that's another aspect of this war, is the Americanization of Ukraine, the corporatization of Ukraine. And so and McDonald's has also been forced to exit Moscow, where they're replaced by some McDonald's-like restaurant, and everything basically tastes the same because, like, it's not that hard to do. Maybe they don't have the special sauce, but it's also that McDonald's, they're basically embodying the Thomas Friedman theory that countries that have McDonald's don't go to war with each other. Like,
yeah, well, yeah. And also that I think the bet was in like the belief in Washington. I think they actually believe this, that like, if we cut off Russia from the West, that will help accelerate this process where the Russian people turn on Putin. They really, really believe that. Well, what is the result? There was recently an article in Foreign Affairs called Putin's Age of Chaos. And this is by a writer with like like the Carnegie Russian Center or something like that, some like Western aligned think tank in Russia. And what she reports is basically, I'll read some of it actually, because it's really interesting. She basically writes that according to polls, by every important metric, support for the government has grown since the war. There's a quote. Polls show that since the war began, the percentage of Russians who overtly admire Putin has grown from 8 to 19%, and 68% of Russians now say they want him to be reelected, a significant jump from 48% of Russians before the Russian invasion. The war has also increased support for all official institutions, the cabinet, regional governors, parliament, and even the ruling party, United Russia. And she goes on to say why she thinks this is. And the reason is, she says that, quote, Russians hunger for geopolitical security. And they see Putin as, quote, offering protection from the hostile West. And because of this, the Russian people, again, quoting her, have delegated to Putin the right to deal with the West, which many Russians believe threaten their country's very existence, even if that causes domestic turmoil, owing to stringent sanctions and crackdowns on liberals. So the very thing that Western liberals, Western neocons thought would turn the Russian population against Putin, which is like Western sanctions and a growing Western role in the proxy war to make Russia bleed, has actually increased support for Putin at home. So even by that very narrow metric of like whether or not the U.S. aim in Russia has worked, it's been a it's backfired, as these things always do. And by the way, on the issue of diplomacy, Jens Stoltenberg of NATO, he just bragged just a few days ago, if not yesterday, he bragged that before the war, Russia gave this draft treaty that basically called for Ukraine to be neutral and for NATO not to dissolve, but just to roll back its military infrastructure post 1997. Because after 1997, that's when Clinton began overseeing this huge expansion of NATO. So Russia was asking that the military infrastructure built up in those post 1997 NATO states, not all NATO states, just the post 1997 NATO states, that be rolled back. And Jens Stoltenberg bragged about how, of course, we said no. Of course, we said no to that. And he goes on to say, like, that's why, Russia just wanted to stop NATO enlargement. That's what he says was Russia's goal here. So he admitted it, and he bragged about rejecting Russian efforts to find a diplomatic solution that way. And then what's the result on top of destroying Ukraine? Then when it comes down to a NATO summit where Ukraine's been promised forever, we're going to, make you a member one day. NATO rebuffed Ukraine just a few months ago and wouldn't even tell them what conditions they need to join. So basically, NATO rebuffed Russia's request to declare Ukraine would never join NATO just for the sake of being able to tell Ukraine, yeah, you're actually not going to join NATO anyway. Was this really worth a war? I mean, that's a question that should be asked, but of course it's not.
Well, I think there was a significant exchange between our friend Claire Daly and Jens Stoltenberg that might be illustrative of the kind of absurd rhetoric we've been hearing from NATO. It's a rare moment of accountability for Stoltenberg, so I think it's worth watching.
Mr. Stoltenberg, you asked us to look at where we are today compared to when the invasion started. I'm not really sure what you meant by we. I know you spent a lot of time on NATO, maybe that's the we, about the expansion with Sweden and Finland, but you were considerably quieter about the bitter disappointment experienced by Ukraine in Vilnius, that the hopes that they thought of a path into NATO didn't actually work out according to plan. Our chair said that aid somewhat compensated, which others have kind of said is that Zelensky's silence was basically purchased. But in essence, really, haven't you let Ukraine down in terms of the pathway to membership? And on the subject of Ukraine, is it not the case that your rhetoric and reality are going in opposite directions and the world is beginning to notice? Because you said that Ukraine is gradually gaining ground. That's not true. Since you were here the last time, Ukraine has lost territory. 500,000 men are dead. Ukraine has had to resort to conscription. There's reports of signing people up with disability, with mental illness, men paying money to get out of the country, hiding in their houses. We're now in a bloody war of attrition, and it's simply cruel for it to go on. Now, senior US military personnel are even getting into the pages of the Washington Post and so on, echoing the call made by General Milley last November that there should be peace, and a real peace. If you care about Ukraine, what's your attitude for a peace plan to save Ukrainian lives?
Basically,
I can answer. This is a direct quote from Stoltenberg earlier this or whenever. At some point, he said, "Weapons are the way to peace."
Yeah,
it's a direct quote. So to answer Claire's question, Jens Stoltenberg's peace plan is weapons. Weapons are the way to peace. And by the way, Max, to your point about the death toll, being in the hundreds of thousands for Ukraine, maybe even 500,000. I think that's what you said. So Claire Daly there said that 500,000 Ukrainian men have died.
I think she means the total, including Russians, but which would be correct based on the Pentagon's estimates. But she could also be correct about Ukrainians alone. Yeah,
I took that to mean, I could be wrong, but I took that to mean Ukraine, and I noticed that Stoltenberg did not correct her, and that reminds me of that time when, what's her name, Ursula like the head of the EU, or the
Ursula von der Leyen.
She made the mistake of talking in a speech about like over 100,000 Ukrainian dead, and then they had to edit that out because she wasn't allowed to acknowledge the toll, and that was a while ago. But this reminds me of that. It's just like,
I think they edited out of the tweet and out of their social media accounts because it was like, we got to keep going, keep killing more, because democracy, we're going to win.
Yeah.
It's rare to see Stoltenberg put on the spot like that. But I think it's inevitable when the war is just not proceeding the way that we were told it was going to be by him, by Ann Applebaum and Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic. by Tony Blinken himself, who said that Russia is not only the second strongest army in Europe, it's now, or the second largest army in the world, it's now the second strongest army in Ukraine. So he actually said, this is just in June, right before the counteroffensive started in earnest. He said that Russia was a weaker army than Ukraine's. I mean, where's the accountability for him? Where's the press?
Yeah. Well, what they're doing now, though, is they're getting top official, because of the leaks that have come out saying that U.S. intelligence, has concluded that Ukraine won't achieve its goals in the counteroffensive, primarily the goal of severing Russia's land bridge to Crimea. What seems to be going on is now some people are getting pressured to say the right thing. So this, for example, is from the so-called Institute for the Study of War, that neocon so-called think tank
for the promotion of war.
So this is what they're promoting now a new interview from Trent Mall, who's the director of analysis for the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency. That's the Pentagon's intelligence wing. And he recently spoke to The Economist, and they say this: U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency Director of Analysis Trent Mall stated there is a realistic possibility that Ukrainian forces will break through the entire Russian defense in southern Ukraine by the end of 2023, while a Ukrainian source suggested that upcoming Russian defensive positions are weaker than those Ukrainian forces have previously breached. So now this guy is saying there's a realistic possibility that Ukrainian forces will break through the entire Russian defense this year. That's the first I'm hearing of this, and it totally contradicts other leaks that we've gotten from U.S. intel. And it also contradicts even what his own official said not too long ago, that Ukraine did not have much of a chance. This is John Kirchhofer of the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Certainly, we are at a bit of a stalemate.
Speaking in June.
Certainly, we are at a bit of a stalemate. We do see incremental gains by Ukraine as they commit to this counteroffensive over the summer, but we haven't seen anything to really help them break through, for example, to drive to the Crimea. It's interesting to me, we tend to focus on some of the munitions that the West provides to Ukraine as they fight this out. And we look at some of them as holy grails as they play out. So if you think of HIMARS, certainly that led to some sensational tactical events. And then you see the Storm Shadow missile doing the same thing. And now we're talking about dual purpose, improved conventional munitions or cluster bombs. None of these, unfortunately, are the holy grail that Ukraine is looking for, that I think will allow them in the near term to break through.
So that was a DIA official just a few months ago saying that Ukraine does not have a prospect of breaking through Russian lines. Now the head of analysis for his agency is saying something different. But all this reminds me of a controversy that happened in Syria now 6 years ago, or actually longer, when some whistleblowers, like dozens of people who work for the Defense Intelligence Agency, put out a complaint saying that their leaders were taking their intelligence related to ISIS and Al-Qaeda inside Syria and cooking the books, basically giving the public and the administration a false picture. And we don't know the exact content of what the actual intelligence said beyond that it was related to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But based on what we know from what the DIA said before, we know based on what's been released that the DIA was warning from the start that the insurgency the U.S. was supporting was dominated by Al-Qaeda. And so they came and accused their leaders of cooking the books and preventing the public from knowing about this and giving the administration a false picture. But then you had a investigation on this from the Pentagon leadership. And guess what? They concluded that CENTCOM did nothing wrong. Report: CENTCOM leaders didn't cook ISIS intelligence. So nothing to see here. Totally fine. Sure, there was like dozens of analysts signing on to this complaint saying that our intelligence was manipulated and the books were being cooked, but the leadership did an investigation. I'm sure it was totally independent. And
By the way, is that photo above it like the next 4 potential prime ministers of Finland?
And then the Tony Blair Institute. You want to talk about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, congratulations to former Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin on her golden parachute after serving as the World Economic Forum and NATO boss lady millennial project, delivering Finland into the arms of the war state by breaking its historic neutrality with Russia. She's been rewarded by JP Morgan lobbyist and war profiteer Tony Blair with a position at the Tony Blair Institute. So congratulations to Sana Marine. Only 37, and you've come so far. I don't know if like any, she'll be at the next Burning Man if it doesn't flood. But back to what you were saying, I think that what happened with that report was that the Pentagon military leadership sniffed the backpacks of the moderate rebels and found that they had no connection to Al Qaeda. So it's all good.
I have one more thing on Ukraine before I move on, which is the issue of Biden and Ukraine, which is becoming now more of an issue. Republicans are talking about impeaching Biden over it. And there's one particular angle of the story that's getting more, where we're getting more details of, and it has to do with Biden's firing of Victor Shokin, the prosecutor who was investigating Burisma, which happened to be employing Joe Biden's son, Hunter, paying him over $80,000 a month, and which also was asking Hunter to help relieve the pressure on Burisma and help close the investigations down. And the Biden line from the start has been Biden firing Shokin had nothing to do with helping out his son's business interest. This was the official policy of the U.S. government that Shokin had to go, and that is because he was doing a bad job investigating corruption. And the EU, our European allies, agreed with this. Well, we're getting more and more evidence that that was not true. So the New York Post and another outlet called Just the News, which is a conservative outlet headed by John Solomon, who's done a lot of reporting on this, have come out with memos from both the EU and the US, and both from that period when Shokin was fired. And both these and all these stories show that in all these memos from the EU and the US, they were praising Shokin. Victoria Nuland wrote Shokin a personal letter, like months before he was fired, saying his efforts against corruption were successful and praising him. And this is the latest. This is now out in the New York Post from Miranda Devine. The story is called "Despite Biden's Claims, Europeans Weren't Trying to Oust Ukrainian Prosecutor Targeting Hunter's Firm." And that is based on another memo from the EU also praising Shokin, saying he was doing a great job. And if anybody saw the interview I did with a former Ukrainian official, a former diplomat, about a month or so ago, he worked in the prosecutor general at that time, and he also said that Shokin was doing as good a job as he could under the circumstances. But all of a sudden, in late 2015, right after Burisma asked Hunter Biden for help in getting the investigations in Ukraine killed, that's when the U.S. line changed, and it was introduced by Biden, and Shokin was fired in March 2016. So now this latest, there's just another talking point that's been demolished by documents from the U.S. and the EU, saying that while Biden now claims that this was bipartisan policy and everybody wanted Shokin fired, that's not what the U.S. government was saying. That only changed at a certain point late in 2015, exactly after Hunter Biden was asked to do something, and the person who did do something was Joe Biden, his father.
Didn't Marie Yovanovitch and George Kent, Yovanovitch, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and Kent, who is the State Department, I think, liaison working out of the embassy, didn't they both say Shokin was doing a fine job also?
I don't remember that. What I do know is that George Kent, I just don't know, but George Kent definitely raised concerns that Hunter Biden's job was raising serious conflicts of interest and was going to undermine stated U.S. goals of helping Ukraine fight corruption.
Yeah,
he did raise that concern as it was happening.
That's right.
I can't remember what they said about Shokin's job, but they might have, and since then, I see, like, it's so bipartisan, and like neocons of either party, they unite around the same talking point. Like Ukraine, it's like, what's his name? Senator Murphy, Chris Murphy, John McCain going to the Maidan. This was a bipartisan policy. So there's been such a closing of ranks on this that I wouldn't be surprised that they ultimately, if George Kent, who's a Republican, ended up backing up Biden. But that's not because I think he's concerned with facts, because all they care about is using Ukraine for a neocon agenda. And that's where Democrats and Republicans from the establishment have totally aligned, along with all progressive Democrats now. Not one of them has voted once against funding the Ukraine proxy war.
Yeah. So I think we've fully established that there's a giant effort right now to crush the will of the public, which for the first time shows in polls that it does not support military aid to Ukraine anymore. There's the Wall Street Journal report me and Wyatt talked about last week about the plan to lock in Ukraine support with a memorandum of understanding that will insulate it against political changes like the election of Trump, for example. And so it's just another way of just ignoring what the public wants while forcing it to pay for a giant war. And that's partly what Blinken's trip was about. When Blinken leaves the State Department, he'll go back to like West Exec Advisors, the consulting firm he founded, and he'll make money off the continuation of that war through getting contracts for the arms makers, making tons of money. Another way the public is being suffocated, silenced, is just through the censorship industrial complex. And I did want to talk about that since one of the key arms of this complex, which is the least accountable to the public because it's not even a government entity, but it works closely with the government, is the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League, founded as B'nai B'rith, claims to act in the name of the quote unquote Jewish people. It was founded initially to stop the defamation of the Jewish people, to fight anti-Semitism. And it has now expanded its mission to simply stop hate. And their slogan at their conferences is "Imagine a world without hate." They've moved into Silicon Valley and they've been partnering with the FBI to pressure social media platforms to remove certain accounts. Of course, they accuse them of anti-Semitism, and their new campaign is against Elon Musk since he took over Twitter, because Elon is a rogue. He may not have the best intentions with Twitter. His intentions may be to hoover up enormous amounts of data and to use it for his own malign ends. But since coming into Twitter, what he has done is he has broken the stranglehold over Twitter that the hegemonic force in US politics, which is interwoven with the Democratic Party and many people crudely refer to as the deep state, as well as elements of the Republican Party, the FBI, the DHS, the national security state, and the kind of corporate, the kind of woke politics that work in corporations but don't actually serve the majority of working class Americans, elite kind of stuff. He broke their stranglehold over Twitter. He ended the state affiliated media labels, which was a top priority for the DHS. I mean, they're so mad about that. There's still stories about that. He seems to have stopped throttling us. I mean, I'm finally getting likes that are proportionate to the amount of followers I have. Somewhat. He's doing all kinds of weird stuff. That's Twitter's buggier. The algorithm changes all the time. It's weird. And
the new name sucks.
X, it looks like a porn site. X.com. The logo sucks. It looks like something like we would have designed initially for the Grayzone and then like thrown out after a week or two. So there's all kinds of criticisms that you can have of him, but the ADL is just going after him, trading on its reputation as a defender of the Jewish community, an ill-gotten reputation to be sure, but trading on that, exploiting Jewish historical suffering to advance the agenda and power-hungry, malevolent imperatives of the hegemonic political force in the US, which is now it's centered in the Biden administration. And so this doesn't really have anything to do with Jewish power, in my opinion. But what the ADL is doing through the backlash it's created, because somebody who happens to be one of the 3 richest men in the world, who's extremely powerful and who the government often depends on for quote unquote innovation, the deep state, the national security state, is depending on him for Starlink in Ukraine to provide them with communications, is actually pushing back. And a lot of And so what the pushback has done, this is just a fact. It is increasing anti-Semitic rhetoric because the ADL presents itself as Jewish. It's being exposed for trying to throttle people's voices, suppress them through undemocratic hidden means. And some people are blaming all Jews. So I argue that Jewish Americans are not well served by an organization like the ADL, running around claiming to act on our behalf and shutting down debate, crushing the First Amendment, working with the FBI and DHS to do so, and attacking anyone who says anything against a foreign system of apartheid taking place 5,000 miles from the US, accusing them of being racist Jew haters who need to be basically criminalized, and that we could reduce anti-Semitism by simply having no ADL. So that's my opening rant. But me and Aaron, we're Jewish. We're opposed. I'll speak for myself. I'm an anti-Zionist. I'm completely opposed to the existence or the imposition of an exclusivist Jewish state through force and demographic management on an indigenous population. It's been a disaster. That itself increases anti-Semitism. So we've been critics of the ADL for a long time, and the ADL has targeted me directly. Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the ADL, personally was calling on Hillary Clinton to denounce me throughout the 2016 presidential campaign. I mean, I could spend the next hour talking about why that is, but he was just obsessed with getting the Clinton campaign to denounce me. And they did. I had nothing to do with them. Both the Trump campaign and the Clinton campaign denounced me as an anti-Semite. I think I'm the only person with that distinction.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was Jake Sullivan did it. He wrote a letter or a statement on Hillary's behalf. I don't even know if Hillary signed off on it, but it was Jake Sullivan. But anyway,
you were criticizing Elie Wiesel for basically associating with Nazi apologists, right? Wasn't that the impetus?
Yeah, for hanging out with like Pastor John Hagee, who said that the Antichrist was half Jewish and homosexual with fierce features, and like Elie Wiesel just getting money from him because he's a corrupt slime bag. So I said it. Anyway, I don't want to get lost in that. The point is the ADL they go after the Defamation League. They've gone after so many people. They extort people. They extorted Kyrie Irving because he made some like silly comments that were like derived from Black Hebrew Israelite ideology. And they used it to extort $500,000 from him. He was forced to give them $500,000 after they condemned him as an anti-Semite. They love to humiliate Black public figures, especially who are seen as non-compliant. They're always attacking Roger Waters. They were at the forefront of the campaign to portray him as an anti-Semite for mocking a fascist demagogue in his show, which draws from the wall. Abe Foxman, their former CEO, he announced that he was canceling his subscription to the New York Times because they showed photos of children killed by Israel during its last military campaign in the Gaza Strip. They're just disgusting anti-Palestinian racists. They take cops every year. They take about 50 to 100 police leaders to Israel to tour the apartheid wall and to lobby them on Israel as a model for policing in the US. Think about that. Israel sees Palestinians as terrorists. So the cops learn to see American civilians as potential terrorists through their trip to Israel with the ADL. And let's go back to the ADL and their kind of new role as leaders of the censorship industrial complex. This is Jonathan Greenblatt describing what he does now. This is not something that you would have thought they would be doing 20 years ago, but here we are.
The ADL, our Center for Technology and Society, works actively with all the kind of companies from Silicon Valley, from Apple to Zoom, if you will, from Amazon to Microsoft to Meta, and indeed to Twitter. We've dealt with them for years, helping them tackle the challenges of hate speech on their service. We point things out, we share information, but what we've said again and again and again, and I've had the privilege of speaking directly to Elon a few times, the reason why we are so concerned is because we think Twitter is such a consequential service. And again, allowing people who created the toxicity on the platform that led to real world violence. Keep in mind that the conspiracy theories that dominated on Twitter for so long exploded in places like Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, and of course, ultimately in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th.
What real world harm did Twitter cause? And also the Pittsburgh killing, where a white supremacist or neo-Nazi went and massacred Jews in a synagogue, that happened before Elon took over Twitter, years before. January 6th, that's Twitter's fault? He's essentially arguing, he's targeting Twitter directly, because Twitter is the one social media platform that isn't fully under the control of the censorship industrial complex because of Elon. And so they're bringing him in to paint it basically as a hate site. And here's an interesting exchange between Andrew Ross Sorkin on CNBC and Jonathan Greenblatt, where Andrew Ross Sorkin actually asks if Jonathan Greenblatt is extorting money from Elon the same way he did with Kyrie Irving. And listen to his reply.
Are you seeking, 7 days of the week. Can I ask a question? Because I know this has been a critique of your organization and of many. Were you seeking to have some kind of either role at Twitter or any kind of donations made or other things?
No.
I only say that because there have been folks who've looked at these situations and felt that they were being shaken down.
Look, I think, let me be honest about that, right? I think it is sort of anti-Semitic trope to suggest when Jewish people express a degree of outrage over anti-Semitism, that somehow that's a shakedown because Jews are greedy.
He immediately issues a non-denial denial and just says anti-Semitism. That's not a historical trope. All these race hustling organizations do that in the US. They accuse you of racism or anti-Semitism or whatever it is, homophobia, and then you comply and you'll maybe you give a donation and then they let you off the hook. That's what happened with Kyrie Irving.
That sounds to me.
I'm not saying you believe that. I'm just saying that is occasionally you hear the critique among not-for-profits in certain cases that are involved in certain causes that talk to companies, and you hear it from leaders who say, I feel like
I hear that, but my view on all of this, we've talked about this before on this show. I don't believe in, and this is really to you, Joe, I don't believe in cancel culture. I believe in counsel culture. Right. So someone makes a mistake, you help them fix it. So what we've tried.
You help them fix it. Like, remember Rick Sanchez when he was on CNN, he went on a podcast and said, Jon Stewart isn't oppressed just because he's Jewish. Like, there are tons of Jewish people working in media. He's not at a disadvantage. I am, as a Latino, trying to make it in media. So the council culture of the ADL came along, and Rick Sanchez was forced to go to a Yankees game with Abe Foxman, and I think go on a trip to Israel and possibly make donations to the ADL. I talked to Rick about this. He said it was like absurd. It just completely absurd, and he had to do it to save his career.
Tried to do over the years with Twitter, with YouTube, with Facebook and all of its platforms, with.
Okay. Well, anyway, of course it's like a shakedown. Of course that's what's going on, but Elon Musk is actually announcing his intention to sue the ADL because he said the majority of censorship requests we get are from the ADL. And he's even come out and said they were trying to shake him down.
Huh.
Here he is. he's responding to that clip, because the answer is yes regarding seeking donations, hence Jonathan Greenblatt's refusal to answer the question. He instead went on the attack, implying that Sorkin, despite being Jewish, is somehow an anti-Semite just for asking a basic conflict of interest question. So the ADL is getting exposed. I mean, other small organizations that support Palestinian solidarity, like the Jewish Voice for Peace, they've had campaigns over the years to try to hold the ADL accountable. And we live in an oligarchy. So an oligarch is finally holding them accountable, and they're on the defensive. And Jonathan Greenblatt is forced to answer all these embarrassing questions, which are so true. And the public is starting to see, particularly Republicans and people on the right who support Trump, because they're the ones who've been targeted disproportionately by the censorship industrial complex. Trump himself, Elon Musk, said that it was the ADL who was pressuring Twitter to take Trump's account off. The former president of the United States was banned by Twitter for several years. That they are starting to see what the ADL is. And I think it's an opportunity to explain, first of all, the ADL doesn't and never has represented Jews or all Jews. They're a sectarian organization that represents ultra-Zionism, but that also they're just part of a larger program that wants to silence all dissent. And it started by silencing supporters of Palestinian equality. It started, including in the 1980s, when the ADL was actually paying spies to infiltrate the anti-apartheid movement in the Bay Area, the movement against apartheid South Africa. And they were working with South African intelligence to do so. And they continually do the same thing to supporters of the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So the Palestinians, once again, they were the canary in the coal mine. Now the ADL is just like running amok, trying to ban everyone. And its whole model has been, most of its model has been exaggerating anti-Semitism. I'll get into that in a second. But they also downplay anti-Semitism when it interferes with U.S. imperial objectives. And here's a good example of that. The Azov Battalion, the ADL actually used to classify the Azov Battalion, the state-sponsored regiment of the Ukrainian military, as a far-right organization with neo-Nazi tendencies that was dangerous. Alex Rubinstein, our contributor at the Grayzone, wrote the ADL to report an anti-Semitic incident, which was Disneyland hosting a neo-Nazi from the Azov Battalion for the Warrior Games, where Jon Stewart gave him a medal. There's so many layers of this story. And the ADL eventually wrote Alex back and said, we believe the Azov regiment or battalion is no longer far right. And they basically said, they're okay now. Why? Because we want to support them. And the ADL is deeply embedded in the Biden administration. And so at the same time that they do this practically, the ADL brands Brandon Tarrant, the very shady Christchurch shooter, as a neo-Nazi, partly because there is a Sonnenrad symbol behind his head. And that is the symbol of the Azov Battalion that the ADL says is no longer far right. So Wyatt really expertly, in a short tweet, exposes the ADL's hypocrisy here. So they downplay anti-Semitism, but they also have historically exaggerated it. And I love this clip from the film Defamation, which is made by an Israeli Jewish filmmaker, Yoav Shamir. All of his films on Israel need to be watched. They really show how demented Israeli society has been by the project of Zionism. It shows, the effect on, especially on Israeli youth, in a very I would say, compassionate way. This film Defamation is incredible because Yoav Shamir, simply because he was Israeli, he walked through the doors of the ADL. This is when they were under Abe Foxman, and said, can I film you guys in action and show how anti-Semitism is functioning? Because I'm making a film about anti-Semitism. And they said, okay, yeah, we love Israel and Israelis. So come on in. And he got inside access, got to go to their board meetings and follow Abe Foxman around. And he soon discovered and got on camera that the ADL was basically inventing a specter of anti-Semitism over American society and keeping Jews in a state of fear, of some Jews in a state of fear and paranoia, while raking in tons of money in the process. And this scene, this 2-minute scene that I clipped out, really shows how it works.
According to the ADL reports from the last couple of years, the average number of anti-Semitic incidents in the US is around 1,500 a year. I'm hoping Joel Levy can help me find a case I'll be able to follow.
What we'd like to do is to follow a case.
I understand, yeah.
You know, every film is like a drive. And once we have like a case that we can follow, so that would be great.
We're going over the fresh data collected over the last couple of weeks to see if there's anything I will be able to film.
We have received in the last week or so someone who employment case, someone who wasn't able to take days off for the holiday.
So that was, these are lists of anti-Semitic incidents. And like you'll see media reports and they'll say anti-Semitic incidents are up 36% according to the ADL since the election of this figure. And these are the incidents. So someone who didn't get hours off from work.
Who is a school teacher and wanted days off for Shavuot. Someone who is a nursing student and had some issues with taking time off, as well as with taking time off. We also,
all right, this sounds like Kristallnacht to me.
Also got a phone call from someone who was complaining about a website that had anti-Semitic remarks on it. Someone who was complaining about an article in the newspaper who they thought had anti-Semitic undertones. And I mean, that seems to be the roundup.
And that's what we've had in the last 2 weeks.
A newspaper that had anti-Semitic undertones is an anti-Semitic incident.
There's no way to predict.
There wasn't anything suitable from the last 2 weeks. So Joel Levy tries to help me to find a case.
What they're looking for is an incident that they might be able, and they will do all the contact work, but an incident they might be able to follow, to actually see something that has happened, to go to the site, to talk to people there, to show what has happened, the impact on them, how we interact with all of that, and so on.
Assemblyman Hickind has a lot of Jewish voters in Brooklyn.
So this is Dov Heikind, who, you know, he was a former leader of the Jewish Defense League, which was a terrorist organization, and he still is an assembly member in the heavily Orthodox area of Borough Park in Brooklyn.
And he suggested a case for me.
You know, I had a very interesting case just last week. A woman went to a funeral in not too far from here, thousands of people, and she heard a police officer on the phone say something to someone else, something very derogatory.
So a police officer said something derogatory on a payphone. That's according to Dov Heikind. So anyway, Yoav Shamir goes around New York looking for this wave of anti-Semitism that the ADL says is taking place. He can't find anything. So, I mean, what they do is what is necessary to destroy anyone like Jeremy Corbyn, for example, which is to simply invent anti-Semitism because it is the most damaging charge. Look at how crazy it drove Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when he was accused of anti-Semitism. Look at what he did. It's the perfect way to politically mug someone. And there has to come a point where they can no longer get away with it, and people will just simply give them the finger. But at the same time, there's a danger to that we have to acknowledge, which is that they've accused so many people of anti-Semitism that they sap the allegation and the concept of anti-Jewish bigotry of all meaning to the point when it actually surfaces, no one will believe it because they'll just say it's another hustle. And so that's the paradox that the ADL has created. And again, right now it's about them versus, you know, the alt-right, whatever you want to call them, because they are disproportionately have faced censorship on social media. But traditionally, it's been about the ADL seeking to destroy Palestinians and their supporters. And here's a good example, one final example of that. And Jonathan Greenblatt just completely lying through his teeth. This was back in 2021 when there was a military assault by Israel on the Gaza Strip. There were a lot of Palestinian marches through New York and LA. There were car caravans of people waving Palestinian flags, and Israelis and supporters of Israel actually went out, and there were like scuffles. But here's what Jonathan Greenblatt said about that.
Daylight. There was one report of cars driving through Jewish neighborhoods in Los Angeles, throwing bottles at homes that had the Jewish mezuzah on the doors. Literally picking out those Jewish homes that could be identified and hurling bottles at them. Like, this is unacceptable. And you can have heated debates about Middle East policy. But just so we're clear, when you target people because they are Jews, that isn't activism, it's anti-Semitism.
He's completely making that up. That never happened. You know that guy from that show, like Truth or Fiction, where he's like, absolutely false. It never happened. Not true at all. That's the meme I want to throw up now because it was completely fake. And what he's referring to is a incident in which, and I wrote about this at the time at the Grayzone, because like all of the incidents that were said to be violent anti-Semitism were condemned by major officials. I think the Biden administration may have issued a condemnation, but Eric Garcetti, then the mayor of Los Angeles, condemned this incident where supposedly Palestinians drove by and attacked Jews in a restaurant. The reality was they were driving by waving Palestinian flags. They didn't even know what the ethnicity of the people in the restaurant was. And they were attacked by people in the restaurant who threw bottles at them. And that's what Jonathan Greenblatt is referring to. He's not only making it up, he's completely lying about people who were falsely accused of hate crime charges. They went on trial, and the court documents show that the judge found them innocent of any hate crime charges, confirmed everything that I reported through my video analysis and analysis of the incident. Like, I just pulled videos together. I did OSINT, you know, I'm an OSINT guy now.
Maybe Bellingcat will hire you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I did what Bellingcat never does, which is do OSINT that upsets official U.S. narratives or official narratives that aren't Russian. And the court documents confirm that the judge sentenced these two guys who fought back after being attacked to several hours of community service and visits to the Museum of Tolerance in LA, which is connected to another phony race hustling organization called the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which was an absurd sentence. They should have never been sentenced to anything. Even the Jewish Daily Forward said that their sentence was too extreme and that it was just a giant lie. The mayor called it a vicious, targeted anti-Semitic attack, and so did Jonathan Greenblatt. So why did the men get accused? Why did they get sentenced to a museum visit? And basically, they say they shouldn't have even been sentenced to visit the museum. So this is the first time I've seen the ADL actually held accountable. They never have to answer for lying about Palestinians and their supporters. They just keep steamrolling them. And so I welcome this moment as an opportunity to educate people about what the ADL has done to us, what it has done to the anti-war left, what it has done to opponents of apartheid for South Africa, from South Africa to Palestine. And it's so pathetic for me to see the NGO wing of the Palestine Solidarity Movement start to freak out and run interference for the ADL, like this group, If Not Now, this sort of Jewish non-Zionist group is whining about the bad people who are against the ADL. Yeah, I don't agree with them, they're bad, but they're like, you've been campaigning against the ADL forever, and now you're afraid that because the wrong people are against the ADL, and all these sort of NGO-ified Palestine solidarity, it's not Palestine solidarity groups, but groups that claim to be in solidarity with Palestinians are now condemning or are now basically saying, we're not this campaign is wrong. This is bad. And these are like the same people who were like supporting the white helmets a few years ago before they were evacuated by Israel. I don't know what they think the ADL is doing here that isn't what they've been doing to Palestinians. This is just simply about one issue, which is censorship. The ADL censoring people and accusing everyone of anti-Semitism and getting more and more power than it ever had before. It has to be opposed. Whether they're censoring the alt-right or they're censoring the anti-war left or Palestine solidarity movement, it's all one thing, and you don't really get to choose. So here's the most pathetic display of simping for the ADL that I've seen, because it's by someone who was a target of the ADL. And it's Mark Lamont Hill, who's like a professor at somewhere. He said, Elon Musk's attack on the ADL is dangerous, dishonest, and deeply anti-Semitic. He has turned this platform into an unprofitable white supremacist cesspool. Instead of taking accountability, he has chosen to not so subtly scapegoat Jews, which invites violence from his Nazi base. Mark Lamont Hill, when he, in a public event, called for freedom for Palestine from the river to the sea, whereas Palestinians are occupied from the river to the sea, was forced to apologize by the ADL, which was trying to force him out of his academic position. Now he's presidential professor at the City University of New York. And
he did lose his job. I think it's CNN or something.
He lost his job.
He was forced out of CNN because the ADL was among the groups to accuse him of anti-Semitism because of those remarks he made in defense of Palestine. And now he's calling Elon Musk anti-Semitic. Yeah.
And he's scapegoating Jews. Like, the ADL doesn't represent Jews. They're like, they're not represented by many of the Jews that Mark Lamont Hill knows and considers, political peers. Like many, even liberal Jews see the ADL as too extreme on Israel. But Mark Lamont Hill is holding the ADL synonymous with Jews. He's not providing any evidence that Elon Musk's attack on the ADL is deeply anti-Semitic. But what he's doing is he's sucking up to his oppressors. He's sucking up to the people that tried to destroy him. And why is he doing that? For the same reason any of these NGO class activists have to do this. They do these performative displays against the bad orange man or Elon, and they're so uncomfortable about everything because they depend on liberals and the hegemonic political force of that's embedded within the Democratic Party for their careers, for their tenure track academic positions, and for the foundation grants to their NGOs, or to fake socialist organizations like Haymarket and Socialism 2023, which is funded by Democratic Party linked foundations. And so they're never going to get anything done because they're playing into this dynamic that doesn't allow them to actually call out the powerful forces that are preventing the kind of progress that even they advocate. So Mark Lamont Hill's just defending the one group that destroyed him.
Yeah. And, I don't know what his motives are, but what I do know is that this kind of his statement there, it sort of gives the impression that the ADL is some sort of good faith actor.
Yeah.
Right. And Elon Musk is somehow impugning the good name of the ADL. That's the implication of what he's saying there. And he knows better than anybody else that they're not a good faith actor at all. They smeared him as an anti-Semite when he spoke up for Palestine. So even if you don't like Elon Musk, I just don't understand why you go out of your way to defend the ADL, who are they are document. I mean, Elon Musk has said some things I really disagree with, and it seems like he has some, he has some weird sympathies that that blind him even to racism in his native South Africa, from what I've seen of what he said. But ADL, they're confirmed bigots. It's not even a question. They're documented bigots against Arabs, especially, but also against black people too, given the vicious attacks against black people who've defended Palestine, as Mark Lamont Hill knows. So why would you go out of your way to stand up for a documented, bigoted fraudulent group that never acts in good faith. That's I don't know. I was very surprised to see that, and I don't know what he said. I mean, said since in response to criticism, but I hope, I hope he's taken some of the criticism in.
I mean, I think he did it to show that he's one of the good ones to the people who guarantee him a career. That was always the way I understood a lot of the culture, the liberal left activist culture of people who are kind of like either professional activists, organizers, or academics, was that they had to play respectability politics. And it always involves, instead of playing into a top, like operating along a class war dynamic, a top-down dynamic, you're operating along a left-right culture war dynamic. And that's what he's doing there. And you have to show that you might be a little bit radical, or you might support the Palestinians, but you're basically one of the good ones. Because when the chips are down, we're going to close ranks with the Democratic Party. We're going to close ranks with Biden because we're scared of whatever fascist you dangle before us. The truckers drive out into Ottawa and they're honking their horns downtown. Well, all of a sudden the radical left is going to come out and do a people's blockade and effectively support Justin Trudeau's emergency law and Chrystia Freeland. Donald Trump's so scary. We'll just come out and endorse Biden. And we won't have time to address it now, but that's what I think was at the heart of the antagonistic exchange between Jimmy Dore and Cornel West, where Jimmy Dore is actually forcing Cornel West to address that contradiction, and how he's basically saying to Cornel West, like, the way your campaign is going, you're just going to wind up closing ranks with, circling wagons with the Democratic Party all over again. And they are the ones who are able to use the courts to jail or indict and possibly jail the opposition leader of the United States, and jail the world's most famous publisher, Julian Assange. So, and I didn't think Cornel West had I think his response was revealing. Some people may agree with his response, but I think that's one of the debates that needs to be had within whatever's left of the left, is where does the problem really lie? And I think the problem really lies with the forces represented by the ADL, and that any sucking up to them is just going to perpetuate the problem of censorship, de-democratization, but other people have to play respectability politics, and it's pathetic.
And you just can't ignore the fact that these claims that Twitter has all of a sudden become this cesspool of hate ever since Musk took over, that coincides with him, allowing the Twitter files, releasing the Twitter files, which showed a huge effort to crack down on social media from the government, which, him unbanning certain people who were previously canceled, like Donald Trump, which obviously angered neoliberals who want to control the information space. And it so happens that after he does all that, then you see all of a sudden these claims about a spike in anti-Semitism. And you also see claims like this. And this is why it's very hard to take all this stuff seriously when you have just calls for outright censorship like this. This came out from the Washington Post recently. Twitter, under Elon Musk's ownership, has played a major role in allowing Russian propaganda about Ukraine to reach more people than before the war began, according to a year-long study released this week by the European Commission. Now, this is a really funny claim, because let's say it's true for a second. Like, let's say, yes, somehow under Elon Musk, all of a sudden, Russian propaganda about Ukraine increased on Twitter. Are we now in the business of censoring propaganda that we don't like, as opposed to like propaganda that we do like? Because every government puts out propaganda. So are we not supposed to say we're only going to allow certain kinds of propaganda? So American propaganda would be okay, about Ukraine would be okay, but Russian propaganda wouldn't. And then, of course, as you pointed out, there actually are no examples of the supposed Russian propaganda about Ukraine in this Washington Post article, because the actual meaning for these people when it comes to Russian propaganda simply means anything that contradicts U.S. propaganda about Ukraine. And you could have said back, to draw a simple example for people who don't get the distinction, like in the lead up to the Iraq War, yes, Saddam Hussein did not want an invasion. Saddam Hussein said he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. So if you were to say back then there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and we shouldn't invade Iraq, would that be classified under this definition as pro-Saddam propaganda? Yes, it would. And
yeah,
this
yeah.
is,
It's like pro-Russian, what they're saying is pro-Russian accounts or Kremlin adjacent accounts, Kremlin aligned accounts.
what does
So
that even
basically they could just, it's up to them, their opinion, and they don't explain their methodology, and we would easily qualify. And so he's allowing us to be there, which means they want us to be banned, even though we have nothing to do with the Kremlin.
Yeah.
We are not the Kremlin. And anyway, that would still be wrong to ban all Kremlin associated accounts, because we have all kinds of official accounts from all over the world. They should be heard from. There should be a robust debate, but they're coming at him from all sides, not because he's right wing or he's racist. They use the racism as a cover the same way they did. Oh, Tucker said some mean things about an anarchist or something, and it was racist. No, it's because he's not letting them control the narrative. That's what it comes down to. And Twitter is so important, even though it doesn't have as many users as Instagram. It's where all the elite voices are.
And this is the latest controversy with Elon Musk, is he's facing outrage because apparently Ukraine wanted to use Starlink, his space-based internet service, to sink or attack the Russian naval fleet in Sevastopol, which is Crimea. And Musk, from what I understand, didn't let them do that because he was trying to prevent a world war. He wanted, he didn't want to be a part of Ukraine attacking Crimea, which would be a huge escalation of that war. And so he's facing outrage from that. And he tried to explain what his thinking was. He says there was an emergency request from Ukraine government authorities to activate Starlink all the way to Sevastopol, the obvious intent being to sink most of the Russian fleet at anchor. If I had agreed to their request, then SpaceX would be complicit. It would be explicitly complicit in a major act of war and conflict escalation. Yes, possibly triggering World War III, for all we know. And he's being attacked for that because he didn't want to take part in bombing the Russian naval fleet in Crimea. I mean, this would be like attacking, the U.S. Command in Florida, in Tampa, Florida. It's like such an important naval base for Russia.
That's what you get. I mean, you depend on a private billionaire for all these communications, for communication systems that are difficult to disrupt with electronic warfare. And so he can turn that off. That's the problem with neoliberalism. Sorry, Ukraine. And he provided it to you for free.
And one more point.
He did it all. I mean, but now David Frum is attacking him.
Yeah.
It seems like a bogus story, but at the same time, if he did it, congratulations. That was like a contribution to peace. I wish that somebody would just turn off the war. If some billionaire could turn off the war, great.
And one more point, that Washington Post story about how Twitter somehow allowed more Russian propaganda, which somehow they don't allow themselves to give an example of. The source for that is said to be the European Commission, but the European Commission source is this fake group called Reset, which is a fake NGO funded by Pierre Omidyar, the Intel adjacent tech oligarch who also funds The Intercept. And Reset, they're behind such hits such as this as well. Remember this after the East Palestine train derailment? Pro-Moscow Twitter accounts tried to steer America's online conversation about last month's train derailment in Ohio. The accounts posted misleading claims and anti-U.S. propaganda designed to spread fear about the toxic spill and mock the U.S. response. So people who somehow criticize the U.S. government for its terrible handling of the train derailment and how its lax standards helped cause the train derailment, they were also just the dupes of Moscow. And of course,
pro-Moscow. That's it. That's it again. It could be us according by their opinion. I mean, all these neocons call us pro-Moscow, so it could be anyone, and they just want them all banned.
And Reset, fake Omidyar's fake group, Pierre Omidyar's fake group is also behind this hit recently from The Intercept. A pro-Putin Facebook network is pumping French language propaganda into Africa. The pages promote Russia's line on the war in Ukraine to more than 4 million followers, casting doubt on Facebook's pledge to combat foreign influence campaigns. So this was The Intercept complaining that Facebook is daring to allow pages that promote Russia's line on the war in Ukraine, and basically complaining that Facebook was not censoring them based on a study funded by their own owner, Pierre Omidyar, And by the way, they didn't disclose that Omidyar funded that study and that they were funded by Omidyar until people, including myself, complained, which they finally added that. But so that's the point of all these studies, is to encourage censorship. And personally, even though Elon Musk is not someone who, I'd want to have dinner with, I don't like a lot of what he says. I'm not going to, take part in this pile-on campaign when it's driven by people who one of their main motives is censoring social media and being mad at him that he's not going along with their agenda. If Musk was censoring people the way these people want, if he was censoring, for example, people who question the proxy war in Ukraine, the way it was happening before he took over, a lot, at least a lot more than it's happening now, they'd be completely on board with that. They would love Elon Musk. They'd be kissing his feet. All these people care about is being able to control the information space.
That's it. I couldn't have said it better. That's all this is about. And I'd have dinner with Elon Musk, but that I don't agree with his vision of the world or what he's doing, but I'd have dinner with him just to know what he's about. It wouldn't be like buddy, but I want to know what he's about. And it doesn't seem like anyone actually wants to understand what he's trying to do. It's just about destroying him simply because he's in the way of a much larger project in which people who dissent will have much less voice in putative Western putative liberal democracies, where liberal democracy is just used as a marketing technique to maintain the public's consent. It's not about like left, right. It's just about power. And the ADL is at the heart of it. So, and Omidyar, by the way, was part of expanding the ADL's reach into Silicon Valley. Omidyar, who's sponsoring Reset, and Luminate, which sponsored that study that The Intercept was promoting without any acknowledgement. Pierre Omidyar, the billionaire owner of The Intercept, the eBay guy, he donated tons of money to the ADL to bring them into Silicon Valley as part of the censorship industrial complex. And Omidyar is an intelligence adjacent figure. I think he's being used as a pass-through for a lot of intelligence money so they can do it without their fingerprints. And then he gets a lot of kickbacks. But that's
he also funded that study that called me the most prolific spreader of disinformation about Syria online. That also was from Luminate, another one of his fake NGOs. So he certainly has his hands in a lot of scam campaigns. It's impressive. It's impressive how big his portfolio is when it comes to these fake disinformation groups and how they are used to spread, pro-U.S. hegemony propaganda and smear dissenters. Like, he's got his hand in many pots. And this fake study about Twitter allowing more so-called Russian propaganda is only his latest hit.
Well, more to come. And I'm hoping we'll be able to do I think Monday's 9/11. So I'm hoping we'll be able to do a 9/11 show on Monday. I do want to address the Jimmy Cornell exchange more, but probably by then something new and insane will just mentally besiege us and we'll forget about it. It's an endless, insane campaign season leading up to one of the weirdest elections. I don't even know if it looks like Biden's being replaced. Well, we'll see. Anyway, we'll be back, but it's good to have you back in studio, Aaron. And I got to run now. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but thanks again to everyone who's donated to our successful crowdfunding campaign to bring Kit Clarenberg, Alex Rubinstein, and Wyatt Reed on board, and who supports us in general, like this stream and follow us. We're almost at 300,000 subscribers.
If you haven't donated yet and you can donate, it's at spotfund.com. Just search for Grayzone, or the link is also on Max's Twitter account and also the grayzone.com. Last I checked, it was over $130,000, which is amazing. So thanks everybody for supporting the independent journalism we're trying to do here, and help expand and bring on Kit Clarenberg and Alex Rubinstein and Wyatt Reed. And that's all I got to say. So, yeah.
All right, we're out. Peace.